Okay, so you want to build a wall. Not a fence, not a border post, a wall. Thousands of miles of stone and packed earth running along the top of the world, tower after tower after tower, a line so long you could walk it for years and never reach the end. You want to protect an empire. You want to keep the horsemen of the northern steppe on their side of the map and your farmers safe on yours. And when you're gone, you want the thing still standing, so that 2,000 years later people will look at it and know that someone here, once, commanded the earth itself to hold a line. That's the fantasy. That's the version carved into every postcard and every history book. Here's what the postcard doesn't tell you. You are not building a wall. You are about to pour more human labor into a single structure than any ruler in history before you, and possibly since. You are going to spend it not in gold, because gold isn't the currency here, but in grain, in years, and in bodies. And the thing you build, this impossible line across the top of your empire, is going to fail at the one job you built it for. Not because it wasn't big enough, not because it wasn't strong enough, but because of something no amount of stone can fix. The story of how the Great Wall was actually paid for, and why the most expensive defensive structure ever built ultimately did not defend, is one of the strangest stories in the entire history of money and power. So let's actually build it, brick by brick, cost by cost. The first thing you have to understand, before a single stone is laid, is that there is no the Great Wall. That's the illusion. When you picture it, you picture one continuous gray dragon of brick winding over green mountains near Beijing, watchtowers every few hundred meters, wide enough to march soldiers across the top. That wall is real. But that wall is a fraction of the story, and it's one of the last chapters, not the first. In 2012, China's National Heritage Administration finished the first complete scientific survey of the entire structure, using GPS and satellite mapping to trace every surviving fragment. The number they came back with was staggering. 21,196 kilometers, over 13,000 miles. More than 43,000 individual heritage sites, walls, trenches, forts, beacon towers, scattered across 15 provinces. If you stretched it out, it would wrap more than halfway around the planet. But here's the part that reframes everything. That 13,000 miles was not built by one person, in one reign, for one reason. It was built and rebuilt, abandoned and re-abandoned, over more than 2,000 years, by over 20 different states and dynasties, each one adding to or tearing down what the last had left behind. The earliest sections go back to the 7th century before Christ, walls of pounded dirt thrown up by rival kingdoms who were fighting each other, not the North. The famous brick wall you're picturing came almost 2,000 years later under the Ming dynasty, and even that most iconic version runs about 8,800 kilometers, of which only around 6,000 is actually constructed wall. The rest is trenches and natural barriers, cliffs and rivers that they simply folded into the line, because a mountain you don't have to build is the cheapest wall there is. So when you say you want to build the Great Wall, the first honest thing anyone can tell you is this: you're not building a wall. You're signing your empire up for a construction project that will outlive you, outlive your grandchildren, and quite possibly outlive your entire dynasty, and that every ruler who comes after you will either have to maintain, expand, or watch crumble. Nobody who ever built it saw it finished, because it was never finished. It was a bill that the empire kept paying, in one form or another, for 20 centuries. Now let's talk about how you actually pay that bill, because this is where most people's mental picture completely falls apart. When you imagine an ancient emperor building something enormous, you probably imagine a treasury, a pile of coins, workers lining up on payday. That is not how the Great Wall was financed, especially not in the beginning. The first emperor to connect the walls into a single system was Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified China around 220 years before Christ. He sent a general named Ming north with a massive army, and, behind that army, hundreds of thousands of laborers. But those laborers were not employees. They were a tax. This is the thing to sit with. In the Qin system, and in many dynasties after, ordinary people owed the state labor the way you might owe it money. It was called korv, forced labor as an obligation of being a subject. The empire didn't need to have the cash to hire a workforce. It simply commanded one into existence. Peasants were pulled off their farms, soldiers were reassigned. And in the harshest periods, convicts and prisoners were marched to the frontier in chains to dig and haul and stack until they were told to stop. The wall's true construction cost was never really denominated in coins. It was denominated in human time, extracted by force from people who had no say in the matter. And a portion of it was denominated in lives. Nobody knows the real number, and anyone who gives you a precise one is guessing. The frontier was brutal, winters that killed, food that had to be hauled hundreds of miles over terrain with no roads, disease in the labor camps, accidents across all the dynasties that built it. Some estimates put the death toll as high as 1 million people, and folklore gave the wall a grim nickname. The longest cemetery on earth, with the bodies said to be buried in the works themselves. Take the specific numbers with heavy skepticism, because the record simply isn't there. But the direction is not in doubt. This was a structure that ate people. And here is the first hard economic truth of the whole project. Because the labor was seized rather than paid, the cost of the wall never showed up cleanly on any ledger. The emperor didn't feel it as a number draining out of a treasury. He felt it, if he felt it at all, as unrest, as farms going untended, as families broken and provinces simmering. The bill was real. It just arrived in a form no accountant could total up until it was far too late. So you've conscripted your workforce. Now you have a second problem that is pure economics, and it's one almost nobody thinks about. A wall generates no revenue. A farm produces grain. A mine produces silver. A wall produces nothing. It just sits there, thousands of miles of it, and every single day it has to be manned by soldiers who have to eat, in some of the most remote and infertile country in the empire, hundreds of miles from the farmland that could feed them. Hauling food that far over that terrain could cost more than the food itself. A wall you cannot afford to garrison is not a defense. It's a very long, very expensive decoration. The Chinese solution to this was genuinely clever, and it's one of the reasons the system survived as long as it did. They turned the soldiers into farmers. Along stretches of the frontier, garrison troops were given land right there at the wall and ordered to grow their own food when they weren't standing watch. Military agricultural colonies, essentially self-supplying forts. The idea was that a soldier who grows his own grain doesn't need a supply train dragging rations across 1,000 miles of desert. In the best years, the frontier could partly feed itself, which meant the wall partly paid for its own manning. It never fully covered the cost, and in bad years the whole arrangement broke down and the treasury had to bleed silver to keep the garrisons alive. But it reveals something important about how these people thought. They understood, in their own terms, that the killer expense of a wall isn't building it. It's keeping it staffed forever. Construction is a one-time shock. A garrison is a bill that arrives every single day until the empire falls, and a lot of the wall's engineering was really about driving that daily bill down. The beacon towers, for instance, spaced along the ridgelines, weren't just lookout posts. They were a signaling network. A tower could raise smoke by day or fire by night and pass a warning down the entire line faster than any horse could carry it. That let a relatively thin, cheap garrison cover an enormous frontier, because they didn't all have to be strong everywhere at once. They just had to be able to call for help faster than an attacker could exploit the gap. The wall wasn't only a barrier, it was a communication system designed to make a small defense budget stretch across an impossible distance. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, and where the word economics in the title actually earns its place. Because the Great Wall was never purely a military object. It was also, quietly, a machine for making money and controlling wealth, and this is the part most tellings leave out entirely. Think about where the wall runs. For much of its length, it sits directly across the great overland trade routes, the roads we now lump together and call the Silk Road, the arteries that carried Chinese silk and porcelain west and brought horses, jade, and goods back east. A wall astride a trade route is not just a barrier. It's a choke point, and whoever controls a choke point controls the toll. The gates and passes through the wall became checkpoints, and at a checkpoint you can do 3 profitable things. You can tax the goods moving through, you can regulate who is allowed to cross, in which direction, and when, and you can control trade in the single most strategically important commodity on that frontier: horses, the raw material of any army that might one day come for you. The wall let the empire decide who got rich from cross-border trade and who didn't, and to take a cut of it in the process. It functioned in part like the world's longest customs house. The military purpose and the economic purpose were braided together. The same gate that stopped a raiding party also stamped a merchant's goods and collected a duty. And notice the geometry of that, because it echoes something true about all valuable real estate. The wall itself is thousands of miles of expensive, revenue-free stone. But the gates, the handful of passes where trade actually flows, are worth a fortune. Almost all of the wall's economic value concentrates at a tiny number of points. The vast majority of the structure just holds the line so that those few gates can be the only doors. It's the same logic as a toll booth on a highway. You don't make money from the 10,000 miles of road. You make money from the one narrow point where everyone has to slow down and pay. The wall was in a sense the most elaborate toll booth ever constructed, with thousands of miles of infrastructure built for no reason other than to make sure there were only a few places to pay the toll. So far, this sounds like it might actually have been worth it. A workforce you didn't have to pay in cash, garrisons that partly fed themselves, a custom system printing revenue at every gate, a signal network that let you defend a continent on a budget. If it all worked, the wall was one of history's great returns on investment. Here is the other side of the ledger, and it's brutal, because the wall had a flaw that no amount of clever economics could patch. A wall is only as strong as the people standing on it, and people can be gone around, and people can be bought. Start with gone around. The wall was long, but the frontier was longer, and the terrain didn't always cooperate. Determined enemies found the gaps, the unwalled stretches, the places where the line thinned out or the garrison had been pulled away to a crisis somewhere else. A wall forces an attacker to go the long way, but it rarely makes the journey impossible. And then there's the far cheaper attack, the one that beat the wall over and over across its entire history. You don't climb a wall that has a gate in it. You find the man holding the gate, and you find his price. Which brings us to the single most important day in the wall's entire military life, and the perfect illustration of why the whole thing, as a defensive investment, ultimately did not pay off. The year is 1644. The Ming dynasty, the same dynasty that built the magnificent brick wall you picture in your head, the most fortified version that ever existed, is collapsing from the inside. A rebel army has already taken the capital. And out at the eastern end of the wall, where it meets the sea at a fortress called Shanhaiguan, a Ming general named Wu Songui is holding the most heavily defended gate on the entire frontier, with the Manchu armies of the north waiting on the other side. For years that gate had held. The Manchus had raided around the wall before, but they had never broken through this pass. It was, by any measure, the strongest point in the strongest wall ever built. And Wu Songui opened it. Caught between the rebels who had seized his capital and the Manchus at his gate, he cut a deal with the Manchus, and he let them in. The gates of Shanhaiguan swung open from the inside, and the army the wall existed to stop simply walked through the door. Within a short time the Manchus held Beijing, and they went on to rule China as the Qing dynasty for the next 2.5 centuries. Read that again, because it is the whole point. The most expensive defensive structure in human history, 2,000 years and untold lives in the making, at its strongest and most fortified point, was defeated not by a siege, not by a breach, not by some new weapon that could smash stone. It was defeated by a man deciding to open a door. Every mile of that wall, every conscript who died hauling stone up a mountain, every ton of grain grown by a soldier farmer to keep a garrison fed, all of it came down to the loyalty of the individual holding the key. And loyalty is the one thing you cannot build out of brick. So now you have to ask the question that has puzzled people for centuries. If the wall didn't reliably do the one thing it was built to do, if it could be walked around and bought open, why did 20 dynasties across 2,000 years keep pouring the wealth and lives of their empires into it? Were they all simply fools? They were not. And the answer is the same kind of answer that explains a lot of things that look irrational until you understand what they're actually for. The wall's real product was never just defense. Defense was the story it told about itself. What it actually delivered was several other things that a ruler found extremely valuable. It delivered control, and not only of enemies. A wall with gates controls your own people as much as the outsiders. It regulates who leaves, who enters, who trades, who pays. It turns a vague, dangerous, open frontier into a hard line the state could tax and police. It delivered legitimacy. Building on this scale was a message, to your own subjects and to every rival, that you commanded resources on a level nobody else could match. A wall you can see from the horizon is a permanent advertisement for the reach of the state that built it. And it delivered a use for enormous numbers of people. A ruler with a restless population, idle soldiers, and conquered enemies has a problem. And a giant permanent construction project is one very old answer to it. The wall absorbed labor, occupied armies, and gave the machinery of the state something vast to point itself at. In cold terms, the wall was less a shield and more a colossal instrument of control and statecraft, and the defense it provided, real but leaky, was almost a bonus on top of everything else it did for the people who ran the empire. But none of that made it cheap. And now we come to the darkest lesson in the whole story, the one that turns this from a tale about a building into a warning about the price of ambition. Because a megaproject this size doesn't just cost money and lives. Pushed too hard, it can consume the very power that builds it. Go back to Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, the man who started it all by connecting the walls into a single system. He didn't just build the wall. He built a network of imperial roads, dug canals, standardized the writing and the money and the very width of cart axles across his new empire, and constructed for himself a tomb so vast it came with an entire army of thousands of life-sized terracotta soldiers to guard him in death. All of it at once. All of it on the backs of a population taxed and conscripted to the breaking point. He built one of the most impressive states the ancient world had ever seen, at a speed and scale that still astonishes. And it did not hold. Within roughly 4 years of the first emperor's death, the empire he had forced into existence erupted in revolt, crushed under the weight of exactly the taxes and forced labor that had built its wonders. The Qin dynasty, the dynasty that gives China its very name in the West, collapsed almost immediately, one of the shortest-lived major dynasties in Chinese history, undone in no small part by the cost of building too much, too fast, on too much extracted human suffering. The most powerful man in the world built the most famous structure in the world, and his own dynasty did not survive the bill. The wall stood. The builder's empire fell. That gap between the monument enduring and the maker being destroyed by the making is the true economics of this thing, and it should stop anyone who thinks the only cost of a great project is the one you can see. And even standing, the wall never stopped costing. This is the part that mirrors every expensive thing anyone has ever owned. You don't pay for a structure once. You pay for it forever, or it turns to ruin. The earliest walls were rammed earth, pounded dirt, and dirt does not keep. Rain, wind, and time wear it down. Sections built at ruinous expense by one dynasty were, within a few centuries, low eroded ridges half swallowed by the landscape, and the next dynasty that wanted a wall there often had to build it more or less from scratch. Even the mighty Ming brick wall requires constant upkeep to survive, and once the state stopped caring, it decayed fast. Villagers hauled away cut stone and brick to build their own houses and pens. Weather did the rest. That comprehensive survey I mentioned earlier found that of the famous Ming Wall, only a small fraction remains truly intact. Across the whole structure, the well-preserved sections that tourists actually visit make up less than 2% of what was built. The overwhelming majority of the longest structure ever built by human hands is gone, or reduced to a lump of earth in a field that you would walk right past without knowing what it was. That's the recurring cost trap in its purest form. The wall was never a thing you finished paying for. It was a thing that demanded payment, in maintenance and attention, until the moment the empire could no longer afford it, and then it began, quietly, to disappear. So, after 2,000 years, after the grain and the labor and the lives, after the customs revenue and the signal fires and the self-feeding garrisons, after the gate at Shanhaiguan and the fall of the dynasty that started it, does the Great Wall of China actually make economic sense? For most of its history, judged purely as the military investment it claimed to be, the honest answer is that it was a spectacularly expensive way to buy a defense that leaked. It slowed enemies. It never reliably stopped them. It bankrupted at least one dynasty that leaned on it too hard, and it failed at its greatest test, not to force, but to a bribe. And yet, here is the ending that makes this a story worth telling on a channel about money, and not just a documentary about old stone. The wall was built at unimaginable cost to keep foreigners out, to hold the line, to stop the outside world from crossing in. Today, it earns its living doing the exact opposite. Every year, millions of people from all over the world, the descendants, in a sense, of the very outsiders the wall was built to exclude, pay money to travel to China, buy a ticket, and walk on top of it. The structure that spent 2,000 years trying to keep foreigners on the far side of the mountains now makes its money by inviting them in and charging admission. The thing failed as a barrier and succeeded wildly as a symbol, and the symbol turned out to be worth more and to last longer than the barrier ever did. The most famous section near Beijing is one of the most visited monuments on Earth. The wall's modern revenue stream is tourism, powered by the outsiders it was designed to repel. And that is the real economics of the Great Wall of China, the truth hiding under all the numbers. From the outside, it looks like a wall, a thing meant to divide the world into an inside and an outside and hold that line by force. But it was never really the stone that did the work, and the stone was never really the point. The wall was a 2,000-year argument about what a state would spend, in grain, in labor, in human lives, just to draw a line on the earth and say, this is where we end and the rest of the world begins. As a fortress, that line could be walked around, and it could be bought open, and eventually it was. But as an idea, as a symbol of what an empire was willing to pay to define itself, the line held long after the last garrison went home. The wall didn't survive because it worked. It survived because of what it meant. And people have been paying for it, one way or another, in one currency or another, for 2,000 years. And they are still paying today, at the ticket gate, to walk on the ruins of the most expensive line ever drawn. You wanted to build a wall. What you'd actually be building is the longest, most expensive lesson in history about the difference between what a thing costs, what it's for, and what it turns out to be worth.